The descent began with the clean, crisp reality of a scientific endeavor. Dr. Elias Vance, the expedition's lead and a man whose faith rested solely in the quantifiable rigidity of geology, dubbed the system Rift 19. The name was efficient, sterile, and utterly devoid of the ancient dread woven into the local name, the Maw of the Mountain. Elias liked his facts hard and his nomenclature harder. He named the terror with a number, convinced this act stripped it of its power to frighten. They were 6 hours into the drop, well below the line where the high-altitude fog surrendered to the permanent night of the Earth's inner architecture. The expedition was 6 people strong. Elias, the 3 speleological engineers, Jim Lewis, Ray Peterson, and a silent, competent woman named Dee, the biologist Dr. Angela Morales, and Sam, the communications specialist who doubled as the team's resident gadget guru. The first 3,000 feet was less a struggle against gravity, and more a disciplined surrender to it. They dropped through a vertical shaft so immense it could have swallowed the Empire State Building whole. The only sounds were the measured, almost musical hiss of the rappel devices unwinding the high-tensile synthetic fiber rope, and the cavernous, gulping echo of their own breath, amplified by the staggering geometry of the shaft. The air, initially just cool, was now aggressively cold, heavy with the smell of wet limestone and the raw, ancient absence of the sun. It was the smell of timelessness, of matter that had rested undisturbed since the Paleozoic. Elias, hanging suspended 100 feet above Lewis, ran his gloved hand across the sheer face of the rock. The granite here was unlike anything he had mapped on the surface. It was polished, unnaturally smooth, almost slick, as if centuries of subterranean water pressure had not just carved it, but had sandpapered it down to an impossible sheen. He recorded the anomaly in his waterproof notebook, concluding the phenomenon resulted from unusual tectonic shearing and deep water abrasion. Everything possessed a natural explanation. His rationality was his anchor. By the time they hit the 3,000-foot mark, the temperature stabilized at a constant, bone-aching 45 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the expected geothermal constant for this depth, yet the cold pierced deeper than the ambient temperature warranted. It manifested less as temperature and more as pressure, a dense, metallic chill that soaked into the thermal underwear and fleece linings, settling in the marrow. They paused the descent just shy of 3,200 feet, where the shaft opened slightly into a large domed area, the designated Camp 1. "Elias, come look at this," Angela called up, her voice surprisingly steady, though the beam of her headlamp jittered slightly. Angela, the biologist, was the most sensitive to atmospheric changes, relying on delicate sensors to measure gas content. Elias rappelled down the remaining distance. Angela stared intently at a small readout. Ozone levels registered high, Dr. Vance, anomalously high, almost 200 parts per billion. Elias frowned, peeling off his helmet. The air was still heavy. "Ozone is physically impossible down here, Angela. The environment is too stable. No ultraviolet light, no thermal variation, no lightning." "Exactly," she whispered, adjusting the beam of her lamp so it played over the slick, wet rock floor. "It smells like ozone too if you lean into it. Sharp, like right after a lightning strike or when a cheap motor burns out." The scent was subtle at first, masked by the dominant odor of wet stone, but once noted, the electric tang aggressively pricked the sinuses. An instinctual unease, wholly separate from recognized hazards like rope failure or rock fall, seized Elias. They established Camp 1 in the broad, relatively flat hall. The silence here was remarkable, punctuated only by the slow, steady drip of water from the vast, glistening stalactites overhead. Lewis and Ray began setting up the radio repeater, a vital link back to the surface team 3,200 feet above. Lewis, usually a relentless, joking presence, was suddenly quiet. After wrestling with a heavy antenna spool for a few minutes, he dropped the spool and leaned against the wall, covering his face. "Pressure headache," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Jim, you okay?" Elias asked, moving toward him. Lewis pulled his hand away, and the light revealed a thin, dark ribbon of blood leaking from his right nostril. "Yeah, I think so. Just dizzy. Too much pressure, boss." Elias checked the altimeter and barometer. Both readings were stable, precisely where they should be. The ambient air pressure was not fluctuating, yet Lewis, whose body was a finely tuned machine built for high-altitude engineering, was bleeding. Elias categorized the event as psychosomatic stress and a subtle ear infection, refusing to acknowledge the possibility of an unseen atmospheric shift. He walked over to where Lewis had been leaning, wiping the sweat from his brow. As he did so, he placed his palm on the damp, cool wall. Beneath the thick, reinforced glove, he felt something coarse, like extra rough grit sandpaper, where the granite should have been polished smooth. He pulled back his hand and shone his headlamp directly onto the surface. What he saw was not natural erosion. It was a series of deep parallel furrows, 3 of them, running vertically up the rock face, starting near the floor and disappearing into the darkness 40 feet above. They were impossibly long, deeply gouged, and unnaturally straight, not tectonic fractures. They looked exactly, chillingly, like something had been dragged up or down the wall with incredible force, leaving 3 identical marks in its wake. He rubbed the edges of the deepest groove with his thumb. The rock inside the furrow felt granulated, almost melted. He did not call Angela or the others over. He classified the marks as unusual geological features caused by abrasive detritus carried by a past rock slide. He kept the secret locked in the tightening coil of his own stomach. That night, Elias tried to sleep on his insulated mat, wrapped tight in his 0-degree sleeping bag. The rest of the team was quiet, their breathing synchronized into the low rhythm of deep exhaustion. Elias woke suddenly, violently, not from a noise, but from the sudden profound lack of one. The silence was absolute. Earlier, the continuous, lonely chime of the water dripping from the massive stalactites had been a comforting metronome of the cave. Now, even that had stopped. The air hung utterly still. The density of the blackness felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. It was the complete cessation of all acoustic energy. The cavern had, for one agonizing moment, ceased to breathe. It was an impossible vacuum of sound, so unnatural that it felt loud. Elias lay rigid, heart hammering against his ribs, listening not for a sound, but for the return of the normal, mundane sounds of subterranean life. The hair on the back of his neck rose, a primal response signaling the presence of a superior, invisible hunter. After perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an hour, the silence broke. A single, sharp drip echoed in the vast hall, followed by another, and then the familiar steady rhythm returned. The cave was breathing again. But the fear remained, a cold, sharp shard wedged beneath his scientific objectivity. He stared into the oppressive blackness above, where the ceiling vanished 150 feet up, and wondered what kind of thing demanded absolute silence in a place where no human being had ever demanded anything at all. He did not sleep again until the time arrived to prepare for the next leg of the drop. They were going another 1,500 feet deeper into the heart of the mountain. Elias knew they had left the domain of geology and entered the domain of something altogether different. He knew with the cold clarity of pure dread that whatever had been dragged up those polished walls waited for them below. The next phase of the descent began badly and only grew worse. They were dropping another 1,500 feet, aiming for a total depth of nearly 3/4 of a mile, pushing the limits of the known Rift 19 system. The polished granite of the first chamber had given way to slate and porous limestone. The air was heavier now, thick enough to chew, and the chilling ozone tang was laced with a distinct, profoundly unpleasant odor. Elias had spent his whole professional life mapping the smells of the earth. Sulfur near geothermal vents, the acrid bite of quartz, the clean mineral scent of pure subterranean water. This new smell defied his lexicon. This new smell was a tenacious, sickening blend. The exact scent of metallic blood mixed with stale, wet iron left out in the rain for a century. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse mixed with a rusty junk heap, and it grew stronger with every yard they descended. They moved slower now, the vertical pitches tighter and more treacherous. Lewis, still pale from his earlier nosebleed, was focused entirely on his gear, a concentration bordering on obsession. Ray, the second engineer, had been uncharacteristically silent since Elias had discovered the massive vertical claw marks above Camp 1. They were all holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, a human tendency that Elias knew was irrational, yet utterly unavoidable in the face of the deepening unknown environment. At the 4,000-foot level, they encountered the first undeniable evidence that they were not alone. They were traversing a narrow ledge, a feature Elias had not anticipated, that jutted out over a deep chasm. Dee, the most experienced climber, was setting protection when she called out, pointing her light. On a natural stone shelf, sheltered from the water runoff, lay the remains of a small animal. Based on the size and structure, Angela identified it immediately as a pika, a small, high-altitude mountain hare, common to the region above them. How it had gotten a mile deep into a vertical shaft was the first puzzle. The second, more terrifying puzzle was its condition. The bones were not gnawed, nor were they decomposed in the normal sense. They were pristine white, incredibly brittle, and looked bleached, almost hypercalcified. The edges, particularly around the rib cage and skull, were ringed with clean, stark black boundaries, like a charcoal drawing. The carcass resembled something that had been flash incinerated from the inside out and then perfectly preserved by the dry cave air, not consumed by a typical biological predator. "No stomach acid," Angela whispered, kneeling carefully, her lamp illuminating the terrifying miniature scene. "No teeth marks." Whatever ended this creature boiled the tissue off the bone. Elias felt a cold dread begin to solidify in his gut, replacing the intellectual curiosity. His hypothesis of a specialized, isolated cave predator crumbled under the weight of the evidence. A few hundred feet further down, the slate gave way to a floor of ancient, moist clay, carried into the system by some long-forgotten subterranean river. It was here, in the yielding substance, that Angela discovered the tracks. She crouched low, using a small measuring tape and her field camera. The print was deep, distinct, and shockingly large. "It is not a bear. It is not a wildcat," she murmured, her professional focus barely masking her profound terror. "This print is bipedal, heavy, heel pad about the size of my palm." She held up her own slender hand next to the print for scale. "But look at these toes, Elias. 3 distinct, massive, elongated toes, tipped with claws that must be 3 inches long. They look like they were designed for walking on sheer rock and ripping through soil." She finished photographing and sampling the print, her movements precise. But when she stood up, she was breathing raggedly. It was moving fast. The depth suggests enormous weight, and the stride length. Whatever it is built for incredible speed. The scientific expedition ended there. They were now the prey of a hunting party. The internal tension ratcheted up, transforming the air around them into something flammable. Elias attempted one last time to impose rational order. It is an evolved cave apex predator. Highly specialized, likely blind, relying on thermal or acoustic signatures. A remnant of some forgotten Cenozoic line. But his rationalizing fell flat. His body reacted with a primal, non-geological alarm. The creature moved on 2 legs, possessed tremendous power, and left a trail of cleanly incinerated prey. It was not a bear or a mountain lion. It was a nightmare given physical form. Sam, the communications man, had been struggling with the repeater system for the last 2 hours. The atmosphere interfered with his signal, creating a massive amount of static and drift. He wore noise-canceling headphones, trying to tune out the internal cave noise. Suddenly, he pulled them off, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what, Sam?" "Just the rope," Elias said, annoyed by the interruption. No, not acoustic noise. It is low frequency. My equipment is picking up faint, rhythmic pulses. They are too low for human hearing, but they are strong enough to vibrate the internal structure of the rock. They are short, precise bursts, like someone hitting a massive, dense drum a mile or more away. "Seismic activity?" Ray suggested. "No. It is too regular, too structured. Not random vibration. It is communication. It is heavy movement." Sam shivered. "Something enormous is shifting huge chunks of rock far below us." They reached the final obstacle before the potential area of the record-breaking depth. A narrow, vertical fissure they dubbed the Needle. It was barely 2 feet wide and went straight down, requiring them to rappel one by one, with minimal light penetration. Elias ordered Lewis, the best climber and most meticulous with anchoring, to go first and set the main bolts for the rest of the team. Dee monitored the tension, and Ray stood by with the auxiliary line. Lewis gave a brief mechanical nod. "Roger that. Going down." He clipped into the main line, checked his harness one last time, and slid into the fissure. The heavy metallic smell intensified as he vanished into the crack. The wait was 15 minutes, an eternity in the crushing silence. Lewis was supposed to signal a clear path and secured anchors once he reached a level staging area 50 feet down. Dee monitored the tension on the main line. It was smooth, steady tension. Lewis was working. 10 minutes passed. 11. 12. Finally, Dee tightened her grip on the line, listening for the expected pull signal. Instead of the crisp, practiced tug on the line, a sound ripped through the fissure that froze the blood in Elias's veins. It was a sharp, dry crack, like a massive tree branch snapping under immense force, followed by a brief, choked grunt. The sound was instantly and violently cut off, replaced by the profound, aggressive silence they had experienced back at Camp 1. Dee's knuckles were white on the rope. The taut tension in the line vanished instantly, replaced by absolute slack. "Lewis!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing weakly in the fissure. Nothing. The deep silence had returned, but this time it was weighted with the crushing certainty of absence. Elias knew Lewis had not merely fallen. He had been taken. The next few minutes were governed by a horrific blend of military discipline and pure, unadulterated panic. Elias, Ray Peterson, Angela Morales, Sam, and Dee, the remaining 5, were galvanized by the sudden, absolute nature of Lewis's fate. There was no time for grief, only for action. Elias took the lead, driven by the cold necessity of command. "Ray D, we secure this rope. Angela, Sam, you cover me. We are not going down, we are going up. But first we assess." They rappelled down the 50 feet Lewis had descended, but with meticulous, paranoid caution, checking every anchor, every handhold. The silence in the fissure was heavy, almost suffocating. The absence of Lewis's measured movements was a colossal vacuum in the tiny shaft. The space below the fissure was a small, roughly spherical cavern, too narrow to be a proper staging area. It was empty. The engineer had simply vanished. Elias's lamp beam danced across the rock. The only evidence of the recent brutal event was a single, horrifying artifact. An 8-foot length of Lewis's primary climbing rope, the high-grade, half-inch synthetic fiber, lying coiled on the dusty floor. Elias picked it up. His stomach seized. The rope had not been sawed or frayed by abrasion. It was cleanly severed, ripped straight across the warp and weft of the synthetic fibers. The ends were ragged, sticking out like tiny, stressed-out wires, a pattern of failure that required not just sharpness, but an unnatural, ballistic application of sheer kinetic force. "This was not cut," Ray whispered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "This was snapped, ripped. But the worst evidence was on the rock wall itself. This part of the shaft was polished like glass, offering no purchase. Yet, running from shoulder height down to the floor, where Lewis must have been working on the anchors, were 3 parallel gouges. They were deeper than the ones Elias had seen back at Camp 1, and fresher. The pulverized rock dust still lay loosely beneath them. "It did not fall," Dee said, her voice flat, emotionless. "It was grabbed, yanked sideways, and ripped right off the protection." The horrifying truth descended on Elias like a crushing depth charge. Lewis, arguably the strongest member of the team, secured by a rope rated for 8,000 pounds of force, had been eliminated by a single instantaneous burst of strength. No known terrestrial predator possessed the anatomical structure or the pure explosive energy required to accomplish such a feat in a vertical environment. The atmosphere in the small chamber changed instantly, moving from investigation to desperate primal survival. Elias felt his carefully constructed intellectual fortress collapse. Rationality was a tool for the known world. They were now inhabitants of the impossible. While Elias stared at the rope, Angela, the biologist, had gone over to the polished wall. She pointed her light at a smear just above the highest claw mark. "Look here," she ordered. It was a faint, translucent streak, adhering stubbornly to the slick rock. It was already drying, condensing almost instantly in the dry, cold air. Angela carefully scraped a sample into a small, sterile container. "A slimy substance," she murmured, snapping the lid shut. It is highly aqueous, meaning it dries fast. But the odor permeates the container seal. It is pure, concentrated ammonia and rotting protein, like putrefied egg yolk. She shook her head, her eyes wide and black in the lamplight. If these things shed this, they generate an incredible amount of metabolic heat, and their waste system is primarily nitrogenous. They are incredibly efficient killers, requiring immense energy input. Elias made the only possible decision. Expedition terminated. We are retreating immediately. D, take the lead. Ray, back up. Angela, Sam, you stick with me. We ascend now through the main shaft, no detours. His voice was strained but held the necessary ring of command. We are not researchers anymore. We are prey. We move fast, and we use all remaining ordnance for deterrence, not exploration. Elias felt the cool, insidious poison of fear beginning to paralyze his critical thinking. His mind, trained for hard facts and measurable data, was suddenly adrift in a void of incomprehension. This place was not just a deep cave. It was an enclosed, hostile ecosystem ruled by an unseen, inhuman intelligence. As they began clipping their ascending hardware back onto the main lines, preparing for the grueling 3/4-mile climb, the deep silence that had been so oppressive finally broke. It was the sound Sam had registered earlier, but now it was undeniably acoustic, not just seismic. It was a grating, rasping sound. Ksh, ksh, ksh. It was rhythmic, heavy, and deliberate. It sounded precisely like someone, or something, was dragging an enormous rough stone across a floor of slate, perhaps 1,000 feet below them. The rhythm was structured, almost like the slow, powerful cadence of a heavy machine operating in the darkness. It was not a pursuit. It was movement. It was the shift of a large, living mass, and it came from the deepest part of the system, the part they had been aiming for. It reacted to their presence, or perhaps reacted to the sudden, violent acquisition of Lewis. Elias flicked off his headlamp for a moment, letting the perfect blackness wash over him. In that moment of utter sensory deprivation, the grating sound seemed to vibrate directly into his skull. It was heavy, wet, and inexorable. He clipped into his line, the cold metal biting into his glove. "Move," he hissed. "Now." They began their slow, vertical climb, leaving the small, silent pit of Lewis's fate behind them. The grating sound continued below, a slow, geological metronome ticking off the remaining time they had left on this earth. The mountain had already swallowed one member of their party, and Elias knew it was hungry for the rest. He focused only on the slow, upward motion, driven by the cold necessity of survival in a world that had suddenly turned hostile and incomprehensible. Every inch of vertical distance was a painful victory against the massive, unseen thing below. The ascent was excruciatingly slow. Climbing 3/4 of a mile on ropes, even with mechanical ascenders, was a monumental task for exhausted bodies and panicked minds. Elias knew the main shaft was their fastest route to the surface, but it was also the most exposed. The vast open space was perfect territory for an unknown predator that possessed ballistic speed and relied on acoustic tracking. They managed to cover about 500 feet before D, leading the climb, discovered a lateral passage, a narrow slit that promised a more protected, if slower, path. It cut straight through the rock, following an ancient fault line. Ray, the remaining engineer, was practically delirious with fear. "We need to collapse the main shaft, Elias. We brought the charges. We could seal it. Give us time." Elias shook his head, the movement tight and sharp. No, too risky. An unstable charge traps us completely. We are sticking to known routes or those that provide immediate cover. We are moving laterally now. D, lead the way. We keep our lights low and close. They moved off the main lines and squeezed into the side corridor. It was claustrophobic, forcing them into a crouch. The thick, saturated smell of metallic blood was worse in this confined space. It was sticky, coating the inside of their mouths and noses, raising bile in their throats. It was not just a stench. It was an aggressive presence, a territorial marker left by the thing that hunted them. After perhaps 20 minutes of stumbling, scraping movement, Elias felt a distinct shift in the air. It was not a draft caused by temperature differentials or cavern flow. This felt directed, pressurized. It was a rhythmic pulse of air, as if something enormous was breathing with lungs the size of water drums, forcing massive directional gusts through the subterranean pathways. Elias stopped, holding up a warning hand. "Did you feel that?" Angela behind him nodded mutely, her eyes wide. "This is not just a cave system," Elias murmured, the terrifying realization solidifying in his mind. "It is a network, a living structure. This entire mountain is organized around whatever these things are. It is an organism, systemic, and we are inside it." He felt the cold sweat break out despite the low temperature. The moment they conceived of the cave as an architecture designed for the creatures, their position became infinitely more perilous. Angela, bringing up the rear, stopped abruptly and pointed her small lamp beam at the wall, about 6 feet off the floor. On the damp, fine silt clinging to the rock face, there was another perfect print. Not on the ground, but pressed vertically against the wall, at the exact height where a very tall bipedal creature would brace itself. It was listening. Angela breathed, her voice a thin thread of disbelief. It touched the rock. Look at the definition. The print was flawless. 3 massive clawed toes pressed into the moisture with the clear outline of the heel pad. It was vast, powerful, and impossibly placed. It proved 2 things. These things moved silently and vertically without effort, and they were aware of the human's presence in this narrow corridor. They had been shadowed. Sam, the communications expert, was struggling slightly ahead, attempting to set up a micro-repeater in the belief that if they could get one solid uplink, they might be able to call for an immediate directed extraction. He was barely visible around a sharp corner 50 feet up the tunnel. A short, strangled cry tore through the metallic-smelling air. It was Sam's voice, a sound of pure shock instantly cut off. A dull, wet thud followed, the sound of a body hitting stone. Then a brief, frantic, rustling shh, like heavy, dry canvas being dragged across rough rock, which subsided to total silence in less than 2 seconds. The blackness ahead felt like a physical wall. Ray Peterson, standing just behind Elias, let out a high, thin whimper. He began to rock back and forth, clutching his head, his helmet light shaking uncontrollably. He was dissociating, collapsing under the cumulative weight of Lewis's fate and Sam's sudden end. "No, no, no," Ray mumbled, tears mixing with the slick sweat on his cheeks. I cannot move. It is here, Elias. It is everywhere." Elias knew if Ray succumbed to shock, they would all be eliminated. He moved instantly, driven by cold necessity, crossing the short distance to Ray in 2 steps. He slapped Ray hard across the face, the sound loud and flat in the tunnel. The shock worked. Ray stopped rocking, his eyes, momentarily stunned, focusing on Elias. "Snap out of it, Ray," Elias growled, his voice low and dangerous. "The fear is a luxury we cannot afford. It wants the fear. We move now, or we all meet the same end. Only forward. Only up." Elias felt the change in himself. He was no longer the rational geologist, but a cold, driven animal focused entirely on survival. His voice sounded alien even to his own ears, stripped of all academic pretense. They had brought minimal fire ordnance, reserving the flares for emergency signaling. Elias fumbled in his pack and retrieved a small, ancient carbide lamp, a heavy brass lamp that had been relegated to museum status in speleology, but which Elias had brought purely for sentimental reasons. It used acetylene gas generated by water dripping onto calcium carbide to produce a fierce, bright yellow flame. He lit it. The flare sputtered, then caught. The fierce yellow flame, intense and unsteady, cast their shadows into grotesque, dancing giants. He knew whatever hunted them was perfectly adapted to the cold and the eternal dark. Fire, light, and heat were the foreign elements that created a temporary, agonizing frontier. "We keep the fire between us and the dark," Elias commanded. "D, you stay ahead, keep your light focused on the path. Angela, watch the walls. Ray, you stay right on my back. If the flame goes out, we stop. We wait for it to take us." They moved again, slower now, guided by the flickering yellow light of the lamp. The suffocating smell of ammonia and metal seemed to recoil slightly from the heat. Elias could hear the low, frantic rhythm of Ray's breathing immediately behind him. The lamplight revealed the oppressive, damp texture of the corridor walls. The air, heavy and thick, pressed down on them. Elias focused on the light, on the simple, visceral reality of the flame. It was the last, fragile piece of the surface world they had brought with them. The maw of the mountain was closing. The narrow corridor, which had offered the temporary illusion of security, finally opened up, releasing them into a space of truly overwhelming dimension. It was a cathedral of stone, a vast, echoing hall that swallowed the light and the air. The transition was instant and brutal, from the warm confinement of the tunnel to the sudden, icy shock of the cavern's temperature drop. In the immense space, the oppressive silence was replaced by a continuous background static of dread. A soft, rhythmic click-click-click, the dry articulation of hundreds of small joints shifting and settling. It was the sound of the ecosystem waking up. Elias raised the carbide lamp high above his head. The fierce yellow flame, usually bright enough to illuminate a small room, was instantly humbled by the cavern scale. It only succeeded in carving a small, quivering dome of light out of the absolute blackness. It was enough, however, to see the first one. It stood about 75 feet away, partially shrouded by a massive, twisting stalagmite. Its silhouette was impossibly tall, easily 8 feet high when stooped, and taller when fully extended. Its body was lean and whipcord muscled. The skin, wherever the light caught it, appeared wet, slick, and semi-translucent. A sickly grayish white that seemed to absorb and repel the firelight simultaneously. Its structure was horrifyingly reminiscent of a distorted primate, but with the length and power of an apex predator. The rear limbs were massive, engineered for leaping and sheer force. The forelimbs were disproportionately long, ending in the 3-fingered claws Angela had documented on the floor. Elias's gaze fastened on the head. It was elongated, smooth, and utterly devoid of hair or fur. Where the sockets should have been were 2 flat, obsidian black plates. These plates were not merely black, they were highly reflective. They caught the lamplight and threw it back with frightening mechanical efficiency. A twin gleam of unblinking, focused attention. The thing was not moving. It stood in absolute stillness, a grotesque sculpture of muscle and bone carved from the cave's deepest limestone. Elias felt the pressure of its non-visual attention settling on him, a weight far heavier than the 3/4 of a mile of rock above them. This was not an ambush. This was study. The thing processed the sudden intrusion of heat, noise, and light. Ray, immediately behind Elias, let out a choked sound, a mixture of gasp and cry. He was staring directly at the towering shape, his eyes glazed with the absolute truth of its existence. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a piece of slate, and he pitched forward. His helmet light, the last remaining piece of modern illumination in their immediate vicinity, hit the stone floor with a sharp, devastating shatter. The short, loud tink of the breaking glass was the trigger. The world seemed to explode into silent motion. From the blackness surrounding the small radius of the lamplight, shadows detached themselves from the walls. They did not run or walk. They flowed, gliding along the rock faces and floor with terrifying, noiseless economy of movement. 12, 15, perhaps more. The shapes coalesced into a loose, terrifying crescent formation. They were smaller, darker, and faster versions of the massive specimen Elias had first seen, their semi-translucent skin reflecting the lamplight only as quick, sickening glints of wet gray. The pack was now arrayed in a semicircle, holding a precise, unbreachable distance. They moved in almost imperceptible, short micro-jerks, like a swarm of insects moving as a single, terrifying entity. Their silence was the most frightening element. They made no hunting sounds, no snarling, no aggressive calls. Only the constant, light click, click, click of their joints. Elias watched, horrified, as one of the closest things, about 50 feet to his left, slowly, deliberately, raised one of its long, powerful, 3-fingered forearms. It brought the massive paw up toward its elongated, blind face, and it scented the air. The air became thick with the mingled scents, the sour, chemical tang of the things, ammonia, cold metal, and stale protein, and the sharp human odor of their prey, sweat, oil, adrenaline, and profound, unmanageable fear. Elias knew he had to break the analysis, to force a reaction, to prove they were not just objects of study, but things capable of hurting them. He drew a huge, ragged breath and screamed. Not a panicked yell, but a raw, animal bellow of defiance. The sound, massive in the constricted space of his lungs, was instantly flattened, consumed by the sheer volume of the cavern. It returned as a weak, reedy echo, a parody of sound. The pack did not flinch. The figures remained locked in place, reflecting the firelight from their obsidian faceplates. They did not react to the noise. They reacted only to movement, heat, and the absolute magnetic pull of fear. They were surrounded. The moment they moved an inch, the pack would collapse on them, consuming them in the same noiseless, instant brutality that Lewis and Sam had met. The attack, when it came, was not a coordinated surge across the crescent perimeter. It was a single, terrifying shot from the center of the formation, an alpha move designed to break the line and terrorize the rest of the herd. One of the largest, fastest-looking creatures, not the immense white one, but a dark, lean specimen, sprang from its position. It covered the 75 feet, separating them in an unbelievable fraction of a second, an explosion of coiled muscle and shadow. Elias had a terrifying flash of intuition. He threw the heavy brass carbide lamp, not at the creature, but past it, toward the thickest grouping of the pack, toward the right flank. The lamp sailed through the air, hitting the stone floor and scattering a small, burning shower of hot calcium carbide dust and fire. The sudden, intense flash of yellow light and the burst of acrid chemical smoke gave them perhaps 3 seconds of chaotic distraction. "Go! Now!" Elias roared, pushing Angela toward the only narrow exit they had observed. A fissure running diagonally up the far wall away from the main pack. Dee, the engineer, moved with the efficiency of training, already running to set an anchor at the base of the fissure. Elias and Ray brought up the rear. Elias fumbled in his pack for the signal flares, the only remaining ordnance they possessed. He fired the first one directly at the ceiling, high above the pack. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched whoosh followed by an intense, searing white light that momentarily obliterated the blackness. The illumination revealed the ceiling's architecture, and with it, a new layer of horror. The entire vault was crisscrossed with thousands of parallel scratch marks, creating a vast, horrifying geological tapestry of claw-etched rock. The creatures did not just walk below, they ran on the ceilings. The explosion of light and noise bought them another vital 2 seconds. They reached the fissure's entrance, Dee already halfway in. Elias fired a second flare, aiming this time toward the creature that had rushed them. The flare hit the ground 20 feet away, bursting into searing white light and thick, suffocating smoke. The creature, which had been ignoring the milder carbide light, paused, its reflective faceplates flickering violently as the intense white light overloaded its sensory input mechanism. But the speed of the pack was merciless. Even blinded by the light, one of the massive shapes managed to follow the thermal trail. As Ray, driven by panic, scrambled to follow Elias, a powerful, elongated forelimb shot out of the smoke. It fastened instantly around his left ankle. The sound that followed was terrible. A thick, wet, sickening crunch, the sound of dense bone and tendon being pulverized and separated, followed by Ray's strangled, high-pitched scream. The cry lasted only a moment before dissolving into choked, desperate choking. Ray's forward momentum instantly reversed. He was dragged backward with impossible speed, his body bouncing and scraping on the slick stone. Elias grabbed the back of Ray's harness, fighting the incredible, instantaneous pull of the creature. The force was overwhelming. Elias had to make a choice. Survival demanded a cruelty he had never imagined. He pulled the heavy combat knife from his belt sheath, the knife he usually reserved for cutting frozen tent rope, and without looking at Ray's terrified, pleading face, he slashed through the thick nylon webbing connecting Ray's harness to his own climbing rig. The tension vanished instantly. Ray's dead weight, accompanied by a final guttural gurgle from the thing that had him, fell backward into the overwhelming blackness and the waiting, clicking pack. The sound of the pack's collective feeding was not a tearing sound, but a low, subterranean rumble, quickly fading into a deep, consuming silence. Elias had saved himself by committing an act of necessary, instant betrayal. The knowledge of it was worse than the ammonia odor, worse than the cold. "Move, Elias! Move!" Dee screamed from the chimney entrance. Elias scrambled into the narrow fissure, pulling Angela in behind him. The tunnel was a salvation. It was agonizingly tight, barely 18 inches wide in spots, forcing them to shed their packs and crawl on their elbows and knees. The jagged, sharp edges of the fractured rock tore through their clothes, scraping away skin and drawing hot, sticky blood. But the pain was a distraction from the horror, and the tightness was their shield. The massive, powerful bodies of the creatures were simply too large, too muscled, to follow them quickly through the constricted space. Elias crawled forward, the smell of his own blood and sweat mingling with the pervasive ammonia stench. He felt the phantom weight of Ray's harness strap still fixed to his rig, a dead memory of the choice he had made. 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. Dee finally stopped, calling back in a hoarse whisper. Expansion. We are in a major channel. The tunnel abruptly widened. They were able to stand, though crouched low, in a tall, narrow shaft that smelled less metallic and more like pure, clean subterranean water. They had clearly breached a secondary, unknown system of the mountain's architecture. Dee was already scanning the vertical walls. Look, a chimney. Ahead of them, the main shaft angled steeply upward, a vertical, tube-like opening that promised altitude. It was covered in slick, wet flowstone, but it offered a path to the surface. Elias felt a desperate surge of energy. Dee, you take point. Find secure purchase. Angela, you follow Dee. I will bring up the rear. The ascent was treacherous. The flowstone was slick, forcing them to rely heavily on every microscopic fissure and ridge. Dee spotted the first sign that this passage was indeed ancient and potentially used by others. Old pythons hammered into the rock, nearly consumed by rust. They were ancient mountaineering artifacts. They climbed maybe 60 or 70 feet, the air growing colder as the elevation increased. Then, the rhythmic scraping sound they had heard earlier returned. But this time, it was different. It was loud, deep, and sustained. It was a low-frequency sonic pulse, a sound so bass-heavy it bypassed the eardrums and vibrated directly in the chest cavity. It was not a roar, not a grunt, but a massive, drawn-out thrum. It originated from the geological core of the mountain miles below them. This was a signal, a colossal communication being broadcast across the entire subterranean network. Whatever Lewis's fate or Sam's, it had triggered a network-wide alert. The rhythmic thrum was continuous, a pulse of dread filling the shaft. Angela, ascending 20 feet ahead of Elias, stopped abruptly, her body hugging the slick stone. "Elias, look," she yelled, pointing her lamp beam sideways. On the walls, thin sheet-like formations, translucent and almost gelatinous, clung to the wet rock. As Angela's bright halogen light hit them, they absorbed the light and re-emitted it. A faint, ghostly, pale green luminescence, visible only at the periphery of the beam. Angela carefully reached out and scraped a small sample. "Bioluminescence," she whispered, her voice strained, "a form of phosphorescence." "But look at where they grow, Elias. They are forming lines, patterns. They are like trails or indicators." Elias followed the lines of sickly green light with his eyes. They were not random. They radiated outward from points of interest, converging sharply toward the various fissures and openings, then spreading out again into the wider shafts. The horrifying realization struck him with the force of a geological event. These creatures, the blind, silent things below, did not rely solely on thermal or acoustic sensing. They were part of an ecological network. These glowing colonies, fungus, bacteria, or something utterly alien, were navigation markers. The entire system was coded, signposted, and organized. These creatures were not just hunters. They were organized predators living within a cultivated, systematic environment. The deep thrumming signal was an orientation command, sent across the vast network of fluorescent markers. The creatures streamed toward the known exits, guided by the subtle greenish glow of their own cultivated pathways. They were being outflanked, their desperate ascent anticipated. Elias forced himself to move, inch by agonizing inch, towards the only goal left. The cold, blinding reality of the high mountain air. The narrow, vertical chimney ended abruptly. D. Having climbed the last 150 feet in near darkness, emerged onto a ledge and immediately flattened herself against the cold rock face. Elias and Angela followed, pulling themselves out of the cramped fissure and into a space of truly cosmic proportions. This was not a hall. It was a cavity. A colossal, impossible vault. The true heart of the mountain. Elias's headlamp beam was utterly swallowed by the immense volume of the air. The roof was lost in a perpetual swirling blackness, hundreds of feet above. If Rift 19 had a center, this was it. They were in the maw's literal stomach. The hall was shaped like a gigantic natural amphitheater, the walls sloping down dramatically toward a central dais. Elias turned off his lamp, relying on the muted, cold illumination from Dee and Angela's beams, careful to minimize their collective visual signature. In the center of the amphitheater, on a raised elevation of smooth, polished gray stone, was the reason for the size of the cavern. It was the creature Elias had initially seen, magnified and solidified, the alpha dogman of the pack. It was truly immense. At rest, it easily occupied a space 10 feet tall. Its skin was nearly pure white, scarred and thickened, like aged leather stretched over powerful, distorted bone. One of its forelimbs was visibly mangled, twisted at an unnatural angle, the result of some ancient, violent conflict. This was the old leader, the weary, enormous ruler of the abyss. It was preoccupied. Gathered around the dais were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of the smaller, darker, more nimble creatures. They clustered close, emitting the low, rhythmic pulses that Sam had registered, the subterranean drums of their society. But it was not the living creatures that held Elias transfixed. It was the scenery. The dais was surrounded by a meticulous, horrifying arrangement of artifacts. They were dried hides, skins of animals, and unmistakably people. The skins were stretched tight, dried until they were translucent, like thin, yellowed parchment. They were carefully, expertly inverted, peeled away from the underlying muscle and bone, leaving the entire body structure perfectly intact, only hollowed out. These were trophies. Proof of absolute long-term control over the subterranean world. Elias recognized the texture of a mountain goat hide, the rougher, heavier skins of high-altitude yak, and the thinner, terrifyingly familiar texture of human dermis, tanned by the cave air to the color of dirty vellum. This was not a hunting den. This was a throne room. As Elias watched, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the display, the rhythmic thrumming intensified. The massive white creature was still. Then the transfer of power began. A new figure detached itself from the surrounding mass. It was nearly as large as the old Alpha, but younger, its gray-white skin taut and free of major scar tissue. It was impossibly fast. The battle was shockingly quick and utterly silent. save for the low-frequency pulses of the observing pack. The young alpha launched itself at the old leader's neck. There was no theatrical roar, only the soft, heavy, wet sound of flesh connecting with muscle. The old, slow dogman was caught completely off guard. The smaller pack members moved instantly. They formed a tight, aggressive circle around the dueling alphas, enclosing the moment of change. Within 60 seconds, the old leader was down. The young alpha held the body pinned, and the pack closed in. The ensuing act was ritualistic, mechanical. The pack did not tear at the muscle or devour the limbs. They opened the body with precise, terrifying movements, bypassing the heavy skeletal structure. They were after something internal. A few minutes later, the young alpha rose, wiping a slick substance from its faceplates with a powerful forelimb. The corpse of the old leader lay empty and still, already beginning the drying process. The consumption was efficient, quick, and focused entirely on the leadership's internal organs. A symbolic, terrifying act of consuming the predecessor's power. Elias felt a cold, seismic tremor run through his very core. These were not instinct-driven animals. They possessed a complex social structure, hierarchy, and a terrifying, brutal set of rituals for the transfer of command. They were an intelligent, organized, subterranean civilization built on endless consumption. The new alpha, slick with the viscous remnants of its predecessor, stood upon the dais. It raised its head, and the rhythmic thrumming of the surrounding pack stopped instantly. Absolute silence descended, heavier and more focused than before. It had seen them, or perhaps tasted them. The new alpha, magnificent and terrible in its youth and brutal efficiency, stood motionless atop the sacrificial dais. It was oriented precisely toward the shadowy ledge where Elias, Angela, and Dee huddled, 200 feet across the vast, echoing cavern. "It knows we are here," Angela breathed, her voice so low it was almost lost in the void. "It is thermal, or the smell of the blood." Elias pressed his body hard against the cold stone, willing himself and his companions to merge with the inorganic matter of the wall. He stopped breathing, forcing his body into a state of suspended animation, minimizing their thermal signature. The new alpha lowered its head slightly, and the low-frequency pulse, the drumbeat of the deep, began again, short and sharp. It was a command. The pack responded instantly. The scores of smaller, darker shapes began to flow outward, dispersing from the dais. They moved with precision, gliding to occupy key strategic positions along the perimeter of the hall, near every potential exit and fissure. They were chess pieces controlled by a master player. Elias used the precious, agonizing moments of quiet study to revisit his mental map. He recalled a secondary, ancient drainage route mentioned in geological texts, a narrow, barely passable chimney used by ancient herders to find water deep inside the mountain. It was 300 feet above their current position, near the dome of the cavern, hidden in a cleft that was impossible to spot unless you knew precisely where to look. It was their only chance. "Dee," Elias whispered, his mouth barely moving against the stone. "The second fissure, straight up, high corner. You see a vertical seam?" Dee, the silent, efficient climber, scanned the colossal ceiling, her lamp darting briefly, dangerously. She gave a single, small nod. She saw it. "We crawl. Perimeter. No sound. No light until absolutely necessary. Angela, use the moisture on the rock to mask our movement. Stick to the cold spots." The journey across the floor of the throne room toward the faint, vertical shadow that represented their last exit was the slowest 200 feet Elias had ever endured. The Alpha remained perched, a silent, white sentinel on the dais. Elias knew it tracked them. They reached the base of the chimney. It was a narrow, jagged rift, barely wide enough for a human body, cutting vertically into the ceiling dome. Elias pushed Angela toward the opening. "Go, cover the base. I will clip in right behind you." Angela, trembling but resolute, began to climb into the fissure. As she moved, the slight shift in her weight on the unstable rubble created a thin, high scree of rock-on-rock friction. The Alpha heard it. The massive creature on the dais slowly turned its elongated head toward their position. Its focus shifted instantly. From the far end of the cavern, a new, sharp sound emerged. It was a dry, high-pitched whistle, a sound produced by rapid air displacement. It was the sound of massive, latent energy being prepared for instantaneous release. They had been discovered. The margin of error was gone. The whistling sound was the Alpha's command, and the pack responded with terrifying speed. Several of the smaller, darker dogmen dropped from their positions and began to flow across the floor toward the fissure. Elias shoved D hard toward the chimney entrance. "Get inside. Up." He watched, horrified, as the Alpha itself, now fully engaged, launched into action. The colossal white figure did not use the floor. It moved instantly to the nearest sheer wall and began to ascend vertically. It used its enormous three-clawed limbs to grasp the slightest geological imperfection, hauling itself up the wall toward the ceiling dome with the speed of an express elevator. Angela and Dee were already scrambling into the tight confines of the chimney, relying on old, unreliable ropes left hanging by the shepherds of old. The ascent immediately became a desperate vertical sprint against a predator that defied physical laws. Elias, scrambling in last, reached into his pack, pulling out the remaining technical gear. He found the small canister of spare magnesium powder, a lightweight, highly flammable substance. His plan was simple and desperate: create a barrier of white-hot, intense light. The creature's visual receptors, the obsidian faceplates, were exquisitely sensitive to direct, focused light, energy they never encountered in their subterranean ecosystem. Elias reached the first major kink in the chimney, a tight bend 40 feet up. He pulled a handful of the fine, metallic powder and shoved it into a pocket of dry kindling he had saved. "Hold tight, D," he yelled, pulling his own body tight against the stone. He struck a match and lit the magnesium. The result was instantaneous and brutal. A short, violent, white-hot flash of light erupted in the narrow confines of the shaft. The temperature in the immediate vicinity spiked by hundreds of degrees in a millisecond. The blinding light was painful even to Elias's protected human eyes. The dogmen, climbing just 50 feet below him, reacted with the first genuine sound they had produced. A piercing, metallic, high-pitched scree that sounded like the violent, scraping shriek of stressed steel. It was a sound of profound pain and disorientation. Two of the smaller pursuers, scrambling too close to the flashpoint, lost their grip entirely. Their bodies tumbled sickeningly down the shaft, hitting the jagged rock with dull, heavy thuds. The air now stank, not just of ammonia, but of burning ozone and something foul and greasy. The odor of seared, non-human flesh. The temporary inferno had worked. "Keep moving." Elias gasped, choking on the chemical smoke. His eyes watered painfully, but he had bought them 5 feet of distance. The Alpha was still climbing, faster now, having bypassed the initial blast zone. It had learned the parameters of the light, but it had not been stopped. Elias followed Angela and Dee, climbing with a reckless, desperate speed. Every time the sound of the ascending creatures grew closer, a renewed, muffled scree, Elias threw another small packet of magnesium powder down the shaft and ignited it with a cheap butane lighter. The final phase of the ascent was marked by profound changes. The slick, wet flowstone was replaced by rough, dry schist and jagged quartzite. The air began to thin and clear. Elias caught the faint mineral smell of pulverized snow and the biting, invigorating tang of thin, cold wind. Dee, climbing ahead, let out a ragged, choked sob of pure relief. "Light," she croaked. "I see light." It was the milky gray, diffuse daylight of the Himalayan dawn, filtering through a crack no larger than a manhole cover, hundreds of feet above. Elias knew the chase was coming to an absolute head. The Alpha, intelligent and experienced, had changed its strategy. The rhythmic, painful scree had stopped. Instead, Elias heard a scraping sound from a parallel, smaller crack. The Alpha was flanking them, using its knowledge of the system's vertical complexity to bypass the bright light barrier, seeking to intersect their path closer to the surface. Elias pushed himself into a final, desperate surge of energy. He climbed 20 feet in seconds. Angela, just a few feet below the exit aperture, reached up, her fingers scraping the sharp edge of the rock. "Almost there, Elias. I can feel the air movement." A sudden guttural roar of displaced air erupted from the parallel fissure above them, followed by the sickening thud of massive weight hitting stone. Dee, who was anchored at the lead position, jerked violently upward. Her scream was instantaneous and cut off. A thin, panicked shriek that was swallowed by the roaring wind now rushing down the shaft. Elias looked up, his lamp beam flashing against the rock. He saw Dee's climbing harness, still clipped into the anchor, suddenly ripped free of the vertical line. The harness webbing was sheared clean. Her body was pulled violently into the narrow flank fissure, disappearing instantly, pulled by a force too great to resist. The sound of her heavy equipment scraping and vanishing into the parallel shaft was the only marker of her death. She was gone. Elias pushed himself into a final, desperate surge of energy. He climbed the final 10 feet in seconds. Angela, just a few feet below the exit aperture, reached up, her fingers scraping the sharp edge of the rock. "Almost there, Elias. I can feel the air movement." Elias reached up, straining. In that instant, a powerful, vice-like grip fastened around his left ankle. The force was colossal, instantaneous, designed to snatch him clean off the rock. The skin of the thing that held him was shockingly cold, slick with a watery mucus. Elias roared, a raw, painful sound as his weight was violently arrested. He twisted his body, jamming his climbing boot against a jagged protrusion, fighting the relentless downward pull. He looked down, his headlamp shining directly into the massive, powerful forelimb wrapped around his ankle. It was the Alpha. Its face plates were reflecting the ambient light with terrifying efficiency, fixed on his ascent. Elias had nothing left but the ice axe. It was a heavy, razor-sharp piece of forged steel. He yanked the axe from his belt, reversed his grip, and brought it down in a desperate final arc. He aimed for the Alpha's massive knee articulation, where the limb bent at an impossible, terrifying angle. The steel bit deep. There was no scream, only a deep, choking, suppressed huff of air expulsion, a sound of profound injury. The grip on Elias's ankle loosened fractionally. Elias used the moment. He twisted hard, pulling his leg free. He heard the sound of the ice axe tearing free, still embedded in the creature's knee joint. With a final, desperate heave, Elias lunged out of the chimney. He grabbed Angela, pulling her clear of the opening. They collapsed onto a narrow, wind-scoured ledge of rock. The mountain air was shocking. It was 15 degrees Fahrenheit, driven by a wind that roared across the rocky slope. Elias looked back down. The dogmen, including the wounded Alpha, had stopped. They clustered just inside the chimney opening, their dark, wet silhouettes framed by the jagged rock. They refused to come out. The wind and the low temperature were their perfect shield. The creatures, adapted to the thermal stability and the permanent darkness of the deep, were temporarily paralyzed by the hostile environment of the surface. Elias saw the flickering reflections of dozens of faceplates, paused, frozen at the very edge of the world they knew. They watched the two humans crawl away into the blinding, freezing light. The silence of the deep had been replaced by the roar of the wind. They had escaped, but the knowledge of what remained below was an irreversible sentence. The descent from the alpine ledge to the waiting base camp was a slow, stumbling nightmare. They did not speak. Elias and Angela moved as automata. The true horror was inside their own minds, etched onto their souls. When they finally reached the cluster of familiar tents and the shocked, pale faces of the surface team, Elias Vance reverted to the man he had been, the rational, disciplined scientist. The interrogation, conducted first by mountain police and then by an official scientific commission, was meticulous. Elias gave his statement with precise, emotionless clarity. He explained that Lewis, Sam, Ray Peterson, and Dee had perished due to a catastrophic, unforeseen geological event. A major section of the vertical shaft had collapsed without warning, initiated by a deep seismic event. Lewis and Sam were eliminated immediately in the first compression zone. Ray, he claimed, succumbed to a massive internal injury caused by the atmospheric pressure change during the shifting event. Dee, he stated, had been violently pulled into a fractured side fissure by the intense suction of the collapse while trying to secure the final anchor, her death witnessed by him before he and Angela were able to climb past the unstable zone. The authorities were baffled by the lack of seismic data, but the evidence was circumstantial. Elias spoke of sharp rocks, unpredictable geology, and the inherent, deadly risks of deep speleology. He never mentioned the slick white skin, the metallic odor, the bipedal tracks, or the ritualistic consumption of internal organs. He made a choice. Elias knew the truth, that an intelligent, organized subterranean species of apex predator resided in the mountain's heart. He recognized this truth was too large, too terrifying, and too irrational to be accepted by the human world. The terror they had witnessed belonged in the deep, sealed off by the lie of a geological catastrophe. Angela Morales, physically unhurt but mentally shattered, corroborated the story exactly. Her eyes, whenever she spoke, were fixed on a point far above the heads of her interrogators, still searching for the faint, milky light of the surface. Elias, too, carried the scar. He looked into the mirror, noting how the rational, focused light had gone out of his own eyes. They were replaced by a cold, watchful vacancy. the expression of a man who had stared directly into the void and recognized the intelligence residing there. His calm was not peace. It was the intense, hyper-vigilant quiet of a hunted creature. The official conclusion was swift. Rift 19 was designated an extreme hazard zone. The entrance was secured, ringed by heavy military fencing, and the narrow, jagged maw was systematically filled and sealed with thousands of tons of concrete and structural foam. But Elias knew. The mountain did not have one mouth, but countless fissures, rifts, and forgotten shepherd chimneys. They had sealed only one throat. Miles below, in the colossal, echoing structure of the throne room, the young alpha dogman settled onto the polished dais. Its leg, where Elias's ice axe had struck, was already covered in a slick, rapidly thickening scar tissue, healing with terrifying speed. Around the alpha, the pack regrouped, their silent forms arrayed in the ritualistic crescent. They had learned a crucial, catastrophic lesson. They knew the world of heat, light, and cold existed. They had seen their prey escape into it. They understood that beyond their dark, deep empire lay a vast, rich, warm world waiting to be explored. The low, powerful thrumming began again, emanating from the massive, young alpha. It was not a retreat or a signal of pain. It was a calculated, deep-frequency broadcast of intent, a declaration of expansion. The hunt was not over. It had just begun, and this time it led toward the surface,